Bienvenue à toutes et à tous dans ce webinaire consacré à la prise en compte de l'inclusion des personnes en situation de
Welcome to all
handicap
of you to this
dans le
webinar
cycle de
dedicated
planification du
to
secteur
embedding disability
éducation.
inclusion across the
Nous sommes
education
ravis de
sector
vous avoir
planning
aujourd'hui
cycle.
dans ce
We are very
deuxième
happy to have you
webinaire
with us
mondial.
today in this second World Webinar organized through the Community of Practice on disability inclusive education sector planning, which we call COP-DIESP. And this is in the framework of a regional program in West Africa funded by the Italian cooperation through the Italian Agency for Cooperation for Developing Cooperation, AICS, and funded by UNESCO IIEP in Africa, and implemented, by IIEP-UNESCO. And we have Mrs. Cancan with us, who is the head of UNESCO in Africa. Thank you, Sylvia. Can you hear me well? Okay. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to all of you, dear partners, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Was really a great pleasure that I welcome you today on behalf of the UNESCO International Institute for Education Planning, which is IIEP-UNESCO, for the second global webinar of the Community of Practice on disability inclusive education sector planning. It is also a pleasure to see those who were with us for the first edition, and a particular pleasure to welcome our new participants. As a piece of information or a reminder, this community of practice is part of the regional program Planning for Inclusive Education, implemented, as Sylvia said, by UNESCO IIEP in Africa and funded by the Italian Agency for Development Cooperation, AICS. The commitment to inclusive education is a strategic priority for both our institutions, IIEP and AICS, and this commitment is based on a shared conviction that inclusion is not merely an ambition, but as the director of AICS told us in Dakar when we launched this community of practice, it's a fundamental right and an essential lever to realize the principle of leaving no one behind. Through this regional program, Planning for Inclusive Education, our two institutions support 8 West African countries in strengthening their planning capacities, in building their planning capacities with a shared objective, which is to make the inclusion of people with disabilities a guiding principle of education policies. During our first global webinar for this community of practice in February, we had led the foundations for an ambitious collective initiative, launching this community as a space for dialogue, sharing, and co-creation. Today, the strong commitment and engagement around this second webinar confirms the relevance of this initiative and the growing commitment to a truly inclusive educational planning. Today's webinar is a new step in this process, having highlighted during our first session the main role of the data and the essential role. We're now addressing a central point. How can we systematically and operationally integrate disability at every stage of the education sector planning cycle? This discussion is fully aligned with the international frameworks championed by UNESCO, such as the Sustainable Development Goal 4, which calls for ensuring quality, inclusive, and equitable education for all. These are the frameworks that guide the work of UNESCO alongside governments, UNESCO IIP. By supporting the development of robust sectoral plans based on reliable data and long-term vision, we are helping to transform education systems to make them more equitable, resilient, and sustainable. But this transformation relies above all on collective intelligence. The Committee of Practice we launched together fosters such collective intelligence. And today, it continues to develop as a dynamic space for exchanges between decision makers, practitioners, researchers, and partners, And it also aims at extending beyond the borders of the target countries to establish a truly global network serving inclusive planning for education. And I would like to warmly thank all the experts and panelists who will be enriching our discussions today, as well as our partners, such as the Italian Agency for Development Cooperation. And I also would like to thank each and every one of you for your active participation, because it is thanks to your commitment that this community will become a genuine tool for transformation, working towards a fairer and more inclusive education system. And I hope we'll have very fruitful, constructive, and action-oriented discussions. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Tessa. Thank you to all dear participants. In the framework of this webinar, as Ms. Teresina said, we will be guided through the education planning cycle to understand how inclusion can be embedded at each step and what is the role of state and non-state actors in the process, which aims at making this education sector more inclusive thanks to a more robust planning based on equity. We have the privilege of having with us today Mrs. Jennifer Pai, who is a specialist in inclusive education with more than 20 years of experience in the field of education. As a consultant for UNESCO IIEP in Africa, she supports the implementation of the regional program Planning for Inclusive Education, coordinating training foundations for the education sector for the inclusion of people with disabilities, which is proposed to the 8 West African countries mentioned in the program, but also giving them a technical support in the framework of this community of practice. In the first part of this webinar, we will be talking technical points, which Jennifer will lead with a great experience in the field of education reference, but Oswald Kusi-Wedge, who is the analyst in education policy and who is the head of technical cooperation in IIEP-UNESCO in Africa, where since 2017 he's been contributing to the training program and technical cooperation as well as research and development. And he's also an author and the co-author of many analytical works and research articles and regarding the analysis of education. Their joint presentation will lay the conceptual basis around the planning of inclusive education before we then move on to discussions, a very rich panel of discussions. I wish you all a very fruitful webinar. Jennifer, the floor is yours now.
Let me briefly outline what we will cover in this presentation. First, we're going to outline the shift within the area of expertise of educational planning towards a focus on equity and inclusion in line with international normative frameworks. Secondly, we will be responding to the questions, what does the focus on inclusion and equity as drivers mean for educational planning today, and the skills and competencies for educational planning. And thirdly, we'll take a closer look at the implications for the educational planning cycle with particular attention to disability. Concretely, how does IIEP include the focus on inclusion and equity in this cycle? Next slide. First part is about the inclusion and equity as drivers for system transformation. Next slide, please. So there's been a shift in approaches to educational planning from the administration of education systems to a focus on planning as a contextual, political, and transformative practice. So this quote, "Every learner matters and matters equally," captures the normative foundation for positioning the principles of equity and inclusion as key drivers of education system change. Here we're talking about equity, ensuring that every learner is supported fairly, and inclusion, ensuring that every learner is recognized and feels a sense of belonging. Systems must be restructured to achieve both simultaneously, impacting the way we go about educational planning. We'll look in the following how IIEP has responded to this. Next slide, please. Let's briefly look at the international normative basis that defines equity and inclusion as a central obligation of education systems, and that, as a result, has shaped educational planning. First of all, the UNESCO Salamanca Statement. It laid out the policy and moral foundations for inclusion, and it made inclusion the preferred norm, not segregation. And then moving to the Convention on the Right of the Child, together with UNESCO's Convention Against Discrimination in Education, advanced together the inclusion agenda by establishing education as a universal, non-discriminatory right for all children. And then obviously the SDG agenda, with SDG 4 more specifically, has shifted attention to inclusion and equity as part of our understanding of a quality education. Next, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, with its formal accountability mechanisms, this UNCRPD has shifted from a language of good intentions to turning inclusion into a legal duty. It focuses on exclusion as produced by our education systems, highlighting that equity requires systemic structural changes and not just individual solutions. So in other words, our understanding of equity and inclusion has shifted from removing or separating individuals from the mainstream system to changing our systems to ensure they cater to diversity, redesigning the environment so everyone can participate. I'm briefly mentioning General Comment 4 here in this context. I find it to be particularly important in that regard, as it clarifies what governments are actually expected to do to implement the right to inclusion in education. In other words, it addresses the obligations such as provide reasonable accommodation, ensure accessibility, track progress through the collection and analysis of disaggregated data, and train teachers and personnel. Next slide, please. Let's move on to the key aspects of operationalizing these global commitments. What does it mean? Well, we're talking about a shift in understanding equity and inclusion within education systems. Equity and inclusion within the international frameworks has become an organizing principle, underpinning a shift in how educational success is defined, how education systems are structured, planned, governed, and delivered. So rather than focusing primarily on expansion, there is increasing attention to how learning is distributed with greater emphasis on marginalized groups. Secondly, incremental implementation of transformational aspirations. While the international norms are normatively radical, redefining what an inclusive system should look like, in other words, transformational in principle, in reality, the shift towards greater equity and inclusion is incremental. Thirdly, educational planning at the heart of this journey towards equity and inclusion. What does that mean? Well, this is where planning plays a crucial role. It translates the transformational aspirations into an operational approach, into sequenced steps. So educational planning ensures that equity and inclusion, particularly for persons with disabilities, are progressively realized through the systematic removal of barriers and the embedding of key principles and legal obligations, such as accessibility and reasonable accommodation. Next. To summarize, educational planning is not static. It evolves in response to the international normative environment. So as an example, pre-2000 educational planning was conceived as a rational allocation of resources to achieve a predetermined educational goal. Well, today, educational planning is defined as a continuous, adaptive, evidence-informed, participatory process aimed at transforming education systems as a core purpose to achieve greater equity, inclusion, and improved learning outcomes. Next, let's move on to part 2, the implications for educational planning. Next. So the question arises, how have approaches to educational planning changed and continue to change in this normative environment? Next. Well, let us take a closer look at what we mean when we say that educational planning today is a dynamic participatory process aimed at transforming education systems. Well, we're moving from technical and linear planning processes to more adaptive and iterative planning processes. We're also witnessing a shift from top-down planning to more participatory approaches, including more diverse groups of stakeholders, both within governments, but importantly, also beyond in the planning process. So planning has shifted from a focus on equal access within our existing systems to transforming systems, so to ensure equity, inclusion, and barrier-free participation. So while planning processes are still concerned with the efficient allocation of resources, we witness a shift towards placing considerations of equity and inclusion at the heart of the planning process. And this has also triggered greater attention to cross-sector collaboration with the health and social protection sectors, for example. Next. So what does that mean for national planning competencies? Well, to become more concrete, the IIEP competency framework for educational planning and management reflects a broader shift toward competency-based approaches and underscores the central role of strengthened planning capacities in enabling education system change. So the framework defines key knowledges, skills, and attitudes required for effective education sector planning with the aim of strengthening system performance and achieving equitable, inclusive, and quality education outcomes. And it therefore serves as a key tool guiding IIEP's capacity development work and helps ensure that planning processes are coherent, evidence-based, and aligned with national priorities, thereby reducing the risk of fragmented or inconsistent implementation, particularly in advancing equity and inclusion objectives. And it distinguishes between interrelated competencies, highlighting the technical, relational, and strategic dimensions. So supporting member states in developing these competencies is central to IIEP's approach and underpins its contribution to the SDG 4 and the UNCRPD. So within this approach, equity and inclusion are not treated as standalone topics, but rather are embedded across the entire planning architecture. Next. So together, these three competency areas support the implementation of SDG 4. Technical competencies ensure decisions are based on reliable data and evidence, helping identify gaps in access, completion, and learning outcomes and resources. The relational competencies make planning possible by fostering collaboration with diverse stakeholders, ensuring that the voices of communities, teachers, and learners inform decision-making. And finally, the strategic competencies, they provide the vision needed to align policies and systems towards long-term transformation with equity and inclusion at the center. Next. So now I'm going to hand over to Oswald for part 3 of this presentation. Oswald, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I will continue in French just to balance the languages. Alors, la troisième partie porte sur...
Part of this presentation focuses on the disability inclusion and equity, the education sector planning cycle, with the conclusions of people with disabilities seen through a different lens than that of equity. That's very important. Let us look at the next slide. And we will be introducing the different steps, the in the planning process. I'll get back to that later. Let's move on to the next slide for the time being, please. I will show you the different steps of the planning cycle so that we understand how IIEP positions itself when it comes to equity and disabilities. On this slide, we see that there are different steps, 7 steps. The first one concerns the analysis of the education sector. Although we have to report the resins are the first steps in the planning cycle for the education system. And it is then that we look at the available data, how they're used to understand the performance of the system and identify those who's left aside. And this allows us to highlight the inequalities, highlighting the disparities in terms of access, in terms of outcomes, learning outcomes between different groups, thanks to this cross-sectional approach. And you have, of course, the analysis of the education sector in cooperation with different stakeholders allows to develop a book, volume 3, which is a guide, and it gives you a lot of details, this book, about disabilities. Following this first step, you have a second step focusing on the selection of priorities, policies, priorities, and strategies. Sometimes the results of the analysis are turned into priorities and strategies, and it is then that the equity is taken into account. We focus on the design of reforms, targeting reform to reduce disparities, in terms of participation, access, and learning subjects. The idea is not only to deal with that. In the education system, we have to move towards a more inclusive system, and this requires or implies to act in an intentional manner when we're faced to obstacles and to practices or mechanisms, existing mechanisms. And as Jennifer said earlier on, inclusion is not considered as a different element. Inclusion is treated and integrated in the definition of priorities and strategies. Thus, the planning phase has to go beyond the identification of gaps and must actively develop responses with different stakeholders to fight exclusion and to base these actions on evidences and the necessity to reduce these inequalities. So at this stage, it's a strategic orientation. We make choices, we look at the major priorities, what are the challenges, what is the global strategies we should adopt, geographical targeting, for instance, or curriculum changes. So it's really a strategic decision which is guided by evidence and the objectives of equity and inclusion. So you may consider this is a bit abstract, but when it comes to the third step, we have the program design. The purpose is to define how the priorities will be implemented through consistent intervention actions, such as, for instance, policy actions, political actions, support programs. And we also look at the support programs. And we even go beyond these support actions to see how the interventions are implemented and aligned on the needs of the different learners, particularly for those who are faced with many different disadvantages. So our job is to turn these strategies into a structured program that is in line with an approach which we consider as being a smart approach. At this step, the third step, we translate priorities into concrete programs, actions, and planned actions. It's a translation step. And you move from one step to another step, wondering how you can implement a strategy using what type of instruments and for what target group. So this is more concrete, we're structured, and we're measurable. The next one is the costing of financing of education policy. How much will it cost us to implement this policy? So the costing and financing in the education planning aims at making sure that the priorities we have established are realistically funded and aligned on equity and inclusion. You may want a lot of things for the education system, but you have to remain realistic, and you have to take into account that you have a lot of policies to finance, and that maybe we will not be able to finance all of them. So resources are allocated based on the needs for marginalized groups and poor groups, and we have also to pay for the financing gaps. And financing gaps may vary from one country to the other, but what we're trying to do is to stay in a situation to make sure that the funding and financing is equitable and transparent and allows us to reduce inequalities and improve results when it comes to inclusive education. The fifth step is really what we call operational planning, where we translate the analysis of inequalities into concrete and targeted interventions aiming at reducing disparities, be it in terms of access or learning outcomes. And at this stage, we define very clear objectives, a clear objective for each group, and we design inclusive strategies such as gender-sensitive education and inclusive pedagogical approach. We adapt the environment to make sure that the environment is accessible. We allocate resources based on needs, the idea being to promote equity. And you're all familiar with this positive discrimination theme. And then comes the consistency and participatory approach, including, of course, people with disabilities. This helps us move towards a multi-annual planning. And many of you know that I'm talking about operational plans, giving the details of the activities over a period of 3 years with an annual updating. And being an integral part of the sector plan, the operational plan can be derived from the sectorial plan. We can, of course, focus on more strategic aspects. And countries will see whether they need this operation plan or not. So in all the activities of the operational plan, when there is an operation plan, we have to pay attention and make sure that they are dealt with taking into account disabilities. And this is extremely important. You may, for instance, have to do away with environmental or physical barriers. You can want to improve the learning environment by not only targeting the learners, but by just making available, accessible infrastructures in schools, or think about different types of teaching methods. And I can continue to give you more examples. Then comes the sixth step, dealing with the implementation arrangements in the countries, where we define the responsibilities for the implementation of the plan and the programs, using as much as possible what exists in the ministries. It's a step where we can include the development of new structures, such as a steering committee, a joint steering committee, including disabilities. And then comes the last step, where you talk about monitoring and evaluation. Because designing good programs is one thing, having a good and consistent operational plan is also a good thing, but you have also to be able to assess and evaluate whether you are able to achieve good results. So monitoring and evaluation will be aligned on programs and sectorial planning, using indicators to measure progress at different steps. Once again, the idea is always to have an inclusive education where the teachers must be aware of disabilities. As you see, this process is an iterative process, as Jennifer said, which means that you have to fuel the future planning cycles. Some steps like costing and financing have an impact on other steps of the process. It's not totally linear. You move from one step to the other and back again before you end up with a final document. This allows us now to go back to slide number 14 to understand IIEP's approach when it comes to planning. Could we see the previous slide, number 14? Thank you. Here we say that IIEP's approach to education planning highlights that the disability inclusion must be integrated across the entire planning cycle, ensuring that equity considerations inform diagnosis. We have reviewed now the different steps, and you now understand why this is extremely important. The idea is not to see equity as one more element, but as an essential element and an important element of the planning cycle. The idea is to make sure that equity considerations inform diagnosis, policy design, that's the second step, the implementation and evaluation, rather than being treated as a separate intervention. And this is something you can see clearly in the methodological guidelines of the IIEP. So how can the IIEP concretely work with the different countries to have the necessary support when it comes to the analysis and the planning cycle, different countries? For instance, in the Côte d'Ivoire, we have a dedication sector note and an operation plan to support the activities. In 2025, we've been working on a complete cycle sector planning in Tanzania, and we offered another sector analysis and a simulation model aiming at costing and financing education policy. And in Senegal, we have carried out the analysis of the education sector with the costing and the financing of the education policy. And right now, we are discussing with many countries, starting with Benin in 2026. And let's start with Benin. And we will support them in the assessment of the sector plan and the review and the implementation of the plan. In Togo, it's a wider cycle where we assess the sector plan, we evaluate the sector plan, we propose a diagnosis, we update the sector plan. In Somalia, the plan is almost finalized. We worked on the review of the sector plan. And we are discussing with the Côte d'Ivoire to soon start working on planning. And this year we will also support Sierra Leone with a chapter on equity and inclusion in the education system. If we move on to the next slide, we will now focus on what allows an education system to do away with bottlenecks in the planning cycles, particularly for inclusive education and gender-sensitive education. There are different levels, there are different things that must be taken into account. They focus on 3 dimensions that are complementary and interdependent. The first level, what are the gaps of the system? We want to identify points where learners with disabilities are not really sufficiently taken into account, be it in the production or the use of data, or the planning of policies, or the budget allocation, or the budgeting, or the monitoring. The idea is just to see to what extent these different steps will help to add inclusion, and we will see that usually this goes through all the different stages of the cycle rather than being isolated and limited to one step or one stage. And it is important to understand that. This is the first level. Then we have another thing focusing on capacities, because it is one thing to have the data and it is something else to be able to analyze them. Here we will just ask ourselves questions about the availability of the tools and the necessary practices to operationalize inclusion in sector planning. We will focus on the capacity of stakeholders to produce disaggregated data, to have a good knowledge of the data and understand how to integrate inclusion in planning tools. And this is not always easy. And it is important to understand that to properly take into account children in the education system. Let's move on to the next slide now, concerning governance gaps this time. And we will now focus on inclusion. Is responsibility clearly assigned? Are the roles really well distributed in the ministry? Are the coordination mechanisms formalized and institutionalized rather than depending on the certain dynamics? And in the absence of a responsibility framework, inclusion is fragmented and loses its operational efficiency. So you see that all these dimensions are interconnected, and we have to deal with them simultaneously all along the planning cycle. The inclusion of people with disabilities should not be considered as just one segment of the system. This inclusion must be based on consistency, on processes, capacities, and governance capacity. I will stop at that for the moment. Thank you for your attention.
sector planning, and she's also responsible for facilitating peer learning and collaboration within this community. Esther, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. As Jennifer has said, I'd like to invite everybody to participate in this Mentimeter so that we can have an interactive experience during this webinar. As you can see on the screen, the question reads, what part of the education sector planning cycle in your country would be the most challenging to ensure disability mainstreaming? As we've just heard from my colleague Oswald, he's gone through the 7 steps that are included or that are part of the education sector planning. And so we're asking what part would be the most challenging according to you. Please scan the QR code on the screen, and then we'll move on to the questions, answers. Okay, we can see some people responding. 9 responded, 10 responded. Thank you very much. I see that 100% so far have chose costing and financing. Okay, 18 responding. The percentages have now changed. We see that costing is still leading, but followed by program design, as well as policy priorities and strategies. Please go ahead and use the QR code. It's now on the right of your screen. We can all participate using that QR code, as well as the link in the chat. Okay, we still see that costing and financing is leading, still followed by program design, the aspect of policy priorities, as well as monitoring and evaluation is also there. We see there's 13% of respondents mention education sector analysis, which is a fast, very vital step towards ensuring we have disability inclusive education sector planning. So that's good to note. Great, we have 58 of you trying to respond. We'll give you a few minutes to make sure we have all the responses. I see that policy, priorities, and strategies is gaining in terms of percentages. This is the second step after sector analysis. Okay. I think we can conclude here. We have 26% costing and financing, which we assume, is a major challenge, particularly for low and middle income countries where allocating of resources towards inclusion is often a challenge. And then we have education sector analysis, which is the first step. And as mentioned by Oswald, there's a lot of support that IIEP-UNESCO is supporting towards this first step this year and next year. Thank you very much. And now I'll hand it over to Jennifer to continue the panel discussion where we will unpack this further. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Esther. Yes, financing seems to be one of the major challenges, which is probably not that big a surprise. But education sector analysis is something that I would refer you back to the methodological guidelines, volume number 3, chapter 11, where you find the methodology of how to go about this. Oswald mentioned it earlier, and so did I. Let's move on into the next part of this webinar, which will take the form of an interactive discussion. Before doing so, please remember that you can place your questions in the chat, and at the end we will have hopefully 20-minute question and answer session where we will try to address as many questions as possible. Those that we do not get a chance to answer will be answered on the Community of Practice platform later after this event. At this stage, I would also briefly like to mention that we've already received some questions, notably from Mrs. Tiana Rakotondra-Tsimba in Madagascar and from Mr. Robin Chataike from Malawi. And if I remember correctly, also a very active former course participant in our Disability Inclusive Education Sector Planning course. So a big thank you for having sent in your questions early. Well, we'll be hearing from our 3 panelists to explore how stronger equity and inclusion-focused planning can help make education systems more inclusive for persons with disabilities. So I'll be speaking with a representative from the Ministry of Education in Senegal, Mr. Daouda Chow, and a representative from civil society in Sierra Leone, Mr. Abdoulaye Doumbouya, and Mr. Oswald Kusiwede from our IIEP Africa office, and you already know him, given that he's been part of the presentation. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our second panelist, Mr. Daouda Chow. He's a project and program management specialist with over 30 years of experience in Senegal's education sector. He has served in teaching, planning, and advisory roles within the Ministry of Education with strong expertise in educational planning, monitoring, and evaluation. And he has contributed to major national education sector programs, including the Program for the Improvement of Quality, Equity, and Transparency. And he was also part of key projects such as the project to support the development of secondary education. Currently, he is technical advisor to the National Group of Education and Training Partners and monitoring and evaluation manager for the program to support Senegal's basic education system. Our third panelist joins us from Sierra Leone, Mr. Abdoulaye Doumbouya, Dr. Doumbouya is a leader with 15 years of experience advancing the rights of persons with disabilities in Sierra Leone. As founder of the Dorothy Springer Trust, he has expanded education and employment opportunities and driven inclusive policy reform. He has advised organizations, including the World Bank, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, Sight Savers, and government ministries on disability inclusion and national policy. And now as a technical lead for the Secondary Education Improvement Project, funded by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, he strengthened inclusive education nationwide in Sierra Leone. Now let's move quickly to our first question on the role of these three organizations, IIEP, MOE in Senegal, and the NGO Sight Savers. The first set of questions, we'll be focusing on this, and the first goes to Oswald. The IIEP-UNESCO in Africa office is currently strategically supporting some West African countries to embed disability inclusion in the education sector planning cycle. We've just heard about it earlier. Please explain how you are doing this. Oswald, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Oui, tout à fait. L'IIP, UNESCO en Afrique.
We are implementing in education panel. We have Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Gambia. So this program is structured around 4 closely linked components, contributing to the planning of education for the inclusion of people with disabilities. The first component focuses on capacity building, and the program offers government officials and representatives of organizations with disabilities and the civil society training that equips them with the technical skills needed to design and promote inclusive education within their own systems and education and institutions. The second component is the community of practice on education sector planning for the inclusion of people with disabilities, the COP-DIESP, within the framework of which this webinar is being organized. The aim of COP-DIESP is to create opportunities for mutual learning through the sharing of experiences and the exchange of resources on planning inclusive education for people with disabilities. There's also a third component that focuses on the production of evidence. The IIEP will provide technical support to 3 countries, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, and Sierra Leone, to improve the collection and the use of national data on children and young people with disabilities. This availability of data disaggregated by disability as part of the education system assessment is the foundation of a successful sectoral plan for inclusive education, as highlighted during the first Global COP-DIESP webinar entitled Developing Inclusive MS that was held in last February. There's also a fourth component that consists of direct technical support for analysis and the planning. Under this component, UNESCO IIEP in Africa will work in close collaboration with the 3 countries, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, and Sierra Leone, to translate commitments and policies into concrete actions. We will support the development of national analysis sector plans, strategies in various countries.
How is the Ministry of Education ensuring that disability inclusion is effectively integrated into this new plan?
Merci. Bonjour à tous. La question de l'inclusion est une préoccupation pour les...
Inclusion is a very major concern for authorities for regulatory reasons as well. And this is why during planning of education sector planning, this is why it was considered to be a cross-cutting question entitled ministerial strategies. So you have cross-cutting strategies are common to everyone. And all cross-cutting strategies must meet certain requirements. We've defined what we mean by equity and inclusion, which guarantees education, equal opportunities for everyone in terms of access and quality. And we also have strategies that were developed, and they should be contextualized by all programs that are defined, whether it's preschool or elementary school or middle school general, secondary school, and programs focused on higher education and also FTP. So each of these programs must contextualize in the multi-annual program the question of inclusion. And even for operationalizing the principles of equity. Now, these are the strategies. First of all, it's operationalizing the principles of equity and inclusion enshrined in the public policies. So this, whether it's at the level of the plan or the new strategic plan for 2050, we also have to strengthen support programs for the education of people with disabilities. Then developing inclusive school and university infrastructure adapted to the needs of vulnerable learners. So these are programs where these are elementary programs and also programs at other levels as well, whether it's for learners as well. We also need to provide educational provision. We need to promote awareness-raising initiatives to combat stereotypes and encourage the enrollment of disadvantaged groups. We also have to develop and implement vulnerability mapping at all levels. So this is MS that must be improved because, as it was said, in the planning cycle, we have identified diagnosis and planning. In the diagnosis, we also talk about the assessment. So for 2028, the 2018-2022, and we basically looked at certain problems. We've identified certain vulnerabilities and problems, and we really need to improve MS. And this really will help us, in turn, improve disability inclusion. Now, there was no disaggregated data on disability in the MS. We also have to integrate financing mechanisms. We have to relocate financial resources based on the results of the vulnerability mapping to reduce disparities. Now, someone said that irrespective of the will and the efforts made by technicians and IIEP, if there's no political will, we really won't be able to do much. We also have to support vulnerable groups at the medical and psychological level as well. So these are the various questions on inclusion, and this is how they are factored into the new plan. Now, this is strategic, and each program should contextualize in its multi-annual plan the disability inclusion. Thank you for your kind attention.
Straight on to the next question from Mr. Doumbouya. As the representative of civil society on this panel, based on your experience, Mr. Doumbouya, what is the participatory role of NGOs in education sector planning? Over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. For my experience, non-governmental organizations or international non-governmental organizations and civil societies such as Site Savers and other partners, I must say, play a critical participatory and catalytic role in education sector planning by actively engaging and helping to drive change. First, NGOs or INGOs, they do serve as bridges between policy and practice because of the knowledge they have. They bring grassroots realities, especially from underserved and marginalized communities, into the national planning spaces. This, of course, ensures that education sector plans are not just policy documents, but are grounded in lived experiences. Second, of course, INGOs contribute technical expertise. An organization like Site Savers particularly do this in emerging priority areas, including inclusive education. Site Savers has a strong global team of experts and local staff with on-the-ground experience to support ministries such as the MBSSC with evidence-based approaches, global best practices and practical models that can be adapted with national systems. Of course, thirdly, Site Savers strengthen participatory and representation. They create space for organizations of persons with disabilities. They have thematic ambassadors such as youth commissioners, and they engage parents and communities to actively contribute to the planning process, ensuring that inclusion is not just theoretical, but it is co-created. Of course, fourthly, NGOs support data generation and the use of that data through pilot assessment and program implementation. They generate credible data that fits into education sector analysis, as we've just been talking about, and informs planning priorities. Finally, what NGOs do is to play a system strengthening role, and that is evident in a lot of the program that we've been doing here in Sierra Leone. Not by generally creating parallel systems, but by supporting government ownership, building institutional capacity, aligning interventions with national priorities. Site Savers, for example, in collaboration with Cambridge Education and Mott MacDonald through the SSEIP program, or what we locally refer to as Lewi Land program, has supported the MBSSC to translate evidence into action for education sector planning. Of course, evidence from Site Savers and Lewi Land program shows that NGOs play a participatory role by bridging this policy and practice, and they provide this technical expertise. They amplify participation, they generate data for planning and supporting government-led systems. This is how NGOs move beyond the implementation to becoming genuine partners in education sector planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doumbouya. Very detailed, very insightful. Thank you. We're moving into part 2 on evidence-based disability inclusive education sector planning. We're going to address a question to Mr. Chow. We know the critical role that data plays in disability inclusive education sector planning. Mr. Chow, Senegal is piloting the implementation of a unique identifier in its national data system. What is the government's vision regarding the use of this unique identifier as a key planning tool to promote disability inclusive policies and planning? Over to you, Mr. Chow.
Thank you so much. when the Senegalese government's vision is to make the unique identifier, UID, a central pillar of the modernization of public action and a decisive tool for inclusive planning. The speaker is cutting off. The interpreter cannot hear the speaker.
Hello, Mr. Chow?
Hello,
Mr.
lost him. We lost him. He lost connection.
Oui.
Oui, Monsieur Chow, we lost you there for a minute. Could you start over again? I think this connection is back again.
Je vous entends très bien.
Oui, on vous a...
I was saying that the Senegalese government's vision is to make the unique identifier, the UID, a central pillar in the modernization of public action and use it as a decisive tool for inclusive planning. And we've lost the speaker again, says the interpreter. We can't hear the speaker. I'm sorry.
I would suggest that we're moving on to the next question and come back to you if that's okay with you, because we cannot hear you. So I would suggest that we sort out the internet connection. Mr. Chow? Mr. Chow, can you hear me?
Donc, à la fiabilité, à l'unicité.
Mr. Chow, can you hear me? Monsieur Chow? Vous m'entendez? Nous avons des problèmes de...
We've got some connectivity issues.
Hello? Hello, Mr. Chow? I would suggest...
Oui, je vous entends.
Yes, I can hear you. The connection has been restored.
Can you hear me?
Oui, je vous entends. Attendez, je vais arrêter la caméra.
Yes.
Je vais arrêter la caméra pour voir.
I'll try and switch off my camera and see. Right. So I was saying that our vision is to make the unique identifier. Can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me now? Yes. Right, you can hear me. So I'm sorry, I've lost the speaker again.
Monsieur Chow, vous m'entendez? On vous a perdu de nouveau. We lost you again.
Un pilier central dans la modernisation de l'action publique et un outil qui permettra de disposer de données consommables.
In this context, it goes beyond the simple identification function to become a genuine level for transformation. I'm sorry, the speech is rather not clear. The sound is rather not clear.
Let's see whether you can hear me first. Monsieur
Allô?
Chow, vous m'entendez? Je suis désolée, mais je pense qu'on va avancer.
Allô?
On vous entend pas. Non, on ne vous
connecter,
entend
je vais
pas.
désactiver et me connecter à nouveau.
Oui, s'il vous plaît,
Oui.
on va avancer entre-temps, d'accord? On va avancer
Mais moi, je vous entends
entre-temps.
bien.
Oui, on va avancer entre-temps.
Allez-y.
Donc, je vais revenir vers vous pour cette question, d'accord?
Later, but let's just get on with the panel. So we're going to move.
Speaking about disability inclusive policies, the radical inclusion policy in Sierra Leone, launched in 2021, was reflected in Sierra Leone's education sector plan. So, Mr. Doumbouya, can you tell us how the results of the policy implementation, as captured by Sightsavers monitoring and evaluation reports, contribute to the next education planning cycle in Sierra Leone? Mr. Doumbouya, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Of course, the monitoring and evaluation work of Sightsavers has been tremendously instrumental in shaping the next education planning cycle under the Sierra Leone Radical Inclusion Agenda. Sightsavers was involved right at the beginning of the earlier work in the developing the radical inclusion policy, and it's followed through with a lot of M&E work. First, which has been generated in many reports. First, these reports provide credible disaggregated evidence, particularly on children with disabilities. So I remember many years when this work was being done, we went around the country to ensure that we capture those nuances of children with disabilities, who are often invisible in national data systems. Sightsaver studies are instrumental in shaping the data collection tools and data management systems such as EMIS. A lot of the work we've done with the ministry in the EMIS program. This, of course, has helped highlight gaps in access, retention, and learning outcomes, therefore providing solution to these gaps. Second, the M&E findings have helped shift the conversation from policy commitment to implementation realities. So what do I mean by this? The radical inclusion policy is a progressive report. Of course, it identified practical bottlenecks as well when you consider the M&E reports. One example would be the report the M&E reports highlighted limited teacher preparedness when it comes to inclusive classrooms. And of course, there are gaps in assistive devices and learning materials. There's a very weak early identification and referral systems. Of course, one of the latest benchmark we used in the report is looking at the capacity and coordination and communication gaps between district and national levels, including within the special educational needs and disability unit. Thirdly, the evidence has directly informed priority setting for the next education sector plan, which is ongoing, ensuring that inclusion is costed, measurable, and embedded in the sector indicators, not treated as an add-on. Fourthly, Sightsavers M&E has supported the integration of inclusive indicators into national monitoring framework, strengthening accountability and tracking progress over time. Finally, these insights have helped enabled adaptive planning, allowing government and partners to refine strategies based on what is working and what is not. In essence, Sightsavers M&E work has helped move Sierra Leone from intent to evidence-driven inclusive planning. And in summary, across all the implementation of the radical inclusion policy, as I said earlier, Sightsavers and Lewilan M&E evidence has helped make children with disability visible in the national data, surfaced real implementation constraint, informed priority settings for the next education sector plan, and strengthened monitoring frameworks, and supported more adaptive planning. This is how Sierra Leone is moving from strong inclusion commitments to evidence-based deliverable and delivering evidence educational planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doumbouya. Again, very detailed, a lot of insight there of how Sightsavers has contributed as a full partner to the education sector planning process. Let's move on. The IIEP-UNESCO has extensive experience supporting countries in disability inclusive education sector planning. So how are the lessons learned over the years informing the design of IIEP's future support. Oswald, this question is for you. We would be really interested to hear your reflections on this. Over to you, Oswald.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. In my present, I talked about 3 gaps: systemic gaps, capacity gaps, and governance gaps. And these have been clearly identified, but the diagnosis alone is not enough to guarantee progress in planning and an inclusive education sector for people with disabilities. Now, UNESCO IIEP in Africa goes further and asks questions: why do these gaps persist despite decades of frameworks, technical support, training, guidelines with various countries? So it's really a question about focusing on political economy of exclusion by asking questions such as whose voices are missing from the planning table. So we therefore advocate for the active participation of organizations of people with disabilities as key actors influencing education sector planning decisions, as they bring essential perspectives drawn from live experience and strengthened accountability at every stage of the planning cycle. Now, this approach ensures that inclusive education sector planning evolves into a collaborative, evidence-based process in which organizations of people with disabilities, ministries, civil society, teachers' unions, research institutes jointly develop consistent policies that strengthen accountability and incorporate measurable standards for sustainable system-wide change.
Gaps, we must also ask why they persist and whose voices are missing in planning processes. So no doubt we need to move toward more inclusive and collaborative planning, with organizations of persons with disability playing a key role in strengthening accountability and driving the system change that we're all working towards. So thank you very much for that. I'm coming back to Mr. Chow to see whether he was able to connect again so that we can hear his reflections on data issues. Notably, Senegal is piloting the implementation of a unique identifier in its national data systems. So the idea was to hear from him what the government's vision is regarding this unique identifier as a planning tool. So let's see whether Mr. Chow is back and can respond. Mr. Chow, are you there?
Oui, je suis bien de retour. Voilà, très bien, je suis là. Donc,
Très
je
bien.
disais que...
So, as I was saying, now, it's not about only education. What's really of interest is education. Now, in the field of education, we really have consolidated, disaggregated, and continuously updated data. So each year, we will have updated data that are up to date thanks to the reliability, but also due to the identifier. Now, this also helps us remove constraints to inclusion by facilitating access. We also have an exhaustive identifier of people with disabilities and who are still insufficiently captured by traditional systems. As I said, very often what happens is at the MS, it was only the quantitative aspect that was taken into account. How many disabled people in such an academy, in such a school? So we just have numbers, but we really did not know the type of disability and the extent of disability. So this is why inclusion is extremely important. But with the UID, the unique identifier, we will be able to provide information on the type of disability, and we can individualize the disability and know the extent as well. So this really will help us have public resources allocated in an equal and efficient way. So this unique identifier embodies a key ambition of the state to build data-driven public governance capable of anticipating needs, bridging inequalities, and ensuring that no one, especially people with disabilities, are left on the margins of public policy. So everyone should be on board and no one should be left out, especially people with disabilities. So this is the whole point of having the identifier in the education system. Now, for the staff, whether it's teachers or administrative staff or students, each person will have a unique identifier. So, and that way we can actually follow up the student, track the student from the preschool stage right up to the university. So if you know the type of disability, if it's a motor disability, and we will also know the extent of the handicap, if it's really debilitating or if it's just a light handicap. So we really will be able to take the necessary steps and see what pedagogical practices, what teaching practices. And I'm afraid we've lost the speaker. Says the interpreter.
Exactly. So, but we heard very clearly a very big part of your response. So thank you so much. Very interesting to hear the vision for this unique identifier. And we look forward to hearing more about this, how you're going to roll this out within the Ministry of Education. So looking forward to hearing more about this. Thank you very much. Moving on, we're moving to the third part on the challenges and resources. We now have Mr. Doumbouya coming in with the following question to answer. What challenges have you encountered when engaging with the Ministry of Education to integrate disability inclusion into national educational planning, and how has Sightsavers addressed them? Mr. Doumbouya, over to you.
Thank you. Engaging with government, of course, and the Ministry of Basic and Senior Secondary Education in Sierra Leone on disability inclusion is essential, but it does come with challenges, I think, as the question implies. One key challenge is, of course, every government ministry has competing priorities within especially in the education sector. And of course, they often have to balance access, quality, infrastructure, financing constraints, which can make disability inclusion seem secondary at times. Of course, Sightsavers has addressed this by positioning inclusion as integral, not additional, to system strengthening. And that's the key, showing that inclusion or inclusive education improves outcomes for all learners. A second challenge is, of course, a perennial challenge, which is the limited data on disability. Without reliable data, it becomes difficult to plan, budget, or prioritize effectively. In response, Sightsavers has invested in evidence generation, disability disaggregated data and assessment, ensuring that planning decisions are informed and are targeted. And Sightsavers has a research team that looks at this data issue. Thirdly, there's often capacity gaps in different levels, from policymakers to district officials and teachers, on how to implement inclusion practically. Sightsavers addresses this through continuous capacity building, technical assistance, and development of practical tools and guidelines. Fourthly, another key challenge is the perception and stigma, and that's a reality which subtly influence policy and planning decisions. To navigate this, Sightsavers work closely with, I said earlier, OPDs, organizations of persons with disability, and the communities, ensuring that the voices of persons with disabilities are present and influencing decisions. They sit at the decision table. For example, in our SSEIP and Lewiland program, OPDs attend district performance monitoring meetings on a regular basis to ensure that they're able to raise awareness of inclusion issues affecting learners with disabilities. And we've seen how successful that has been. Finally, there can be coordination challenges among stakeholders. And so in this case, Sightsavers play a convening role, making sure that partners are aligned. We support government leadership and ensure coherency in approaches. Also, while investment remains a real barrier, working in partnership using evidence and focusing on systems has helped steadily move disability inclusion forward in national education development planning. In conclusion, as I said, the challenges are there. The challenges are real. However, Sightsavers and partners' approaches are grounded in partnership, evidence, and system strengthening, which has helped steadily advance disability inclusion within national planning processes. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Abdoulaye, for this interesting outline of Sightsavers' work and the challenges, how they address that. We're moving on to the next question. This is for Mr. Chow. I hope the connection is stable. As we were working on the design of the Senegal's new sector plan, as you were working on that, what resources did you recognize as necessary to ensure the successful embedding of disability inclusion in the plan? What challenges did you face? How do you plan to overcome them? Mr. Chow, let's get your connection again. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Very quickly. So the challenges were identified thanks to a diagnosis that was carried out. And this was, Mr. Oswald knows that. There was also the evaluation report and the strategy. Now, we've identified qualified staff and we've identified the diagnosis. The challenges were ensuring the early diagnosis and screening of children with a disability. We have structures that are dedicated. We have the division of schools, and we really make these structures, we give them adequate resources, we give them staff and also financial resources in order to carry out the diagnosis. Our challenge was also to identify the typology of the disability. We did not know the type of disability that children were suffering from. And in order to address this problem, we started we started doing capacity building. Now, this is planned, and this is with component 4. We need to strengthen the capacity of the statistical and foresight statistics, the inspectors of academies as well. So we really need to make MS inclusive. We've already started with this. We've actually distinguished 4 types of disability, and we just have to see what the extent is. And this means we would be able to know the typology. We need to guarantee every child mainstream schooling and teaching and learning opportunities for success, regardless of situation of marginalization and vulnerability, including health issues. And in order to do that, we really need to come out with strategies. Each program should contextualize planning and also the implementation of policies that are adapted to each context. And if this is done, we can really avoid the dropout of children with disabilities. Now, we need resources, and we need material resources, all types of resources, human, financial, and material, in terms of both quantity and quality. And these resources must be secured. Now, for human resources, we really will be doing capacity building for teachers, and not just the people who are in service, but also we're going to train new recruits for strengthening their skills in the field of disability and inclusion. We also need to find financial resources, as I said, and also material resources. So these are the challenges that we are facing, and these are the strategies as well to overcome them. Thank you so much. There was no sound problems. We heard you well. And thank you for your kind answer and your response.
Is for Oswald from an IIEP-UNESCO perspective. What resources are needed to scale up this work, particularly in view of the international 2030 objectives? Oswald, over to you.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you so much. One of the greatest tools for success is inclusive education, inclusion of people with disabilities. And this lies in an intersectoral approach, though you can't actually confuse that with intersectional approach. So this means we have to work with a wide range of stakeholders. Now, the intersectoral approach is about public action. It's a complex problem. Inclusion is a complex problem, and it cannot be resolved by only one sector. So the success of planning for inclusion depends on a range of stakeholders. It includes relevant ministries, such as health ministry, which contributes to the services in nutrition, mental health, rehabilitation, Ministry of Social Affairs, that plays a key role in social protection and provides services for people with disabilities. And we can also talk about the Ministry of Infrastructure, which ensures physical accessibility and safe access to schools. Now, all these stakeholders work together to complement the efforts of the Ministry of Education. Sectoral planning for inclusive education becomes both achievable and sustainable. So now, in addition to institutional coordination, as Mr. Thia also mentioned, qualified human resources are an essential resource for scaling up. The IIEP competency framework highlights, you actually referred to this, Jennifer, it highlights the importance of technical, interpersonal, and strategic competencies for effective planning and management of the education sector. Now, this provides a structural basis for strengthening planners' capacity to design and implement inclusive, equity-focused policies, which serve as a key tool guiding the IIEP's capacity building work. Now, beyond individual competencies and skills, strengthening institutional capacity is also important. This involves embedding inclusive planning practices within ministries, improving coordination mechanisms, and ensuring that data systems and planning processes systematically integrate considerations of disability and equity. Now, to sum up, scaling up education sector education sector planning for the inclusion of people with disabilities is not merely a technical exercise. It's a moral and strategic imperative if countries are to achieve the international goals by 2030. Now, financial resources are important, skilled human capital and institutional capacity from the foundations, but their impact depends on a genuine cross-sectoral collaboration and, of course, political commitment. As part of this effort, IIEP plays a central role both as a catalyst and a capacity builder. Now, through its competency framework, training programs, and technical support, the IIEP equips planners and institutions with skills and tools needed to integrate the inclusion of people with disabilities into education systems. And this is done by fostering collaboration between ministries, strengthening data systems, and designing inclusive policies. IIP ensures that the government does not work in isolation, in silos. They are supported by international expertise and shared learning. The pathway to 2030 requires not only investments, but also a vision, a determination, a collective determination to transform education systems as drivers of equity, resilience, opportunities for all, with the support of IIEP-UNESCO and funders such as the Italian Corporation. The countries can now move from fragmented initiatives and commit to a systemic change that is sustainable, guaranteeing that all children, irrespective of the capacities, have access to an inclusive, equitable, and quality education.
And we're looking forward to hearing more about these approaches in the future. Now, we're coming to an end of this panel discussion. We are running late. But first of all, let me thank the three panelists. Let me also give a brief summary of the main ideas. There's been a lot has been said, so obviously this is not a full summary. Across Senegal, Sierra Leone, and the wider regional program in West Africa that IIEP Africa Office implementing, we learned about a shared shift towards more evidence-based and system-wide approaches to disability inclusive education sector planning. In Senegal, this is reflected in the 2025-2034 education and training sector program, where inclusion is embedded through cross-cutting strategies and on efforts to strengthen data systems. We heard about the unique identifier and targeted measures on financing, infrastructure, and equity. Now, in Sierra Leone, NGOs such as Sightsavers are playing a key role in this process by supporting the generation of disaggregated evidence through monitoring and evaluation, strengthening education management information systems and data systems more broadly, and helping to translate implementation realities into priorities for the next education sector plan. Across the 8 countries in the regional program, now these efforts are further reinforced through capacity development, peer learning, and technical support that bring together these 8 governments, but not just governments, importantly also civil society, non-governmental organizations, and organizations of persons with disabilities. So overall, the common message that appears to emerge is that real progress on inclusion comes from combining stronger data and planning systems with meaningful participation and sustained investment to move from policy intent to implementation at scale. So now let's move to our final part of the webinar. As I said, we're running a bit late. We are inviting our participants from across the globe to share their questions in the chat. So we will gather them and distribute them amongst our panelists. As I said, we've already received some questions from Madagascar and Malawi in particular. Kindly also include your name and country so we can properly attribute your question to you. Now, let me move to our shared document so that I can see what questions have been posed. So the first question here is for Oswald. from Aditi Prasad, who's at the University of Stockholm. What is the timeline of these consultations for governments, from education sector analysis to monitoring? It seems like an unending iterative task. So Oswald, over to you for this question.
Can I go in French or in English?
I think in French.
Okay.
We have different experiences in supporting countries. It depends on the availability of data to start with. It also depends on how we work with the national teams, the availability of the national teams. These are things that are very important when we support a country. There are countries where we spend more than a year from the beginning to the end, while in other countries we completed everything in 8 months. So you can see the experiences vary according to the countries. It depends how the ministries are structured and the policy cooperation. I cannot say that we have just a single schedule. It all depends on the sector analysis. The idea is to carry out a sector analysis, which will fuel the other steps. We do not necessarily need to develop the sectorial one, which is huge. And once we have these first elements, we can just move towards the policy design and then the planning stage. This being said, some countries have sectorial analysis that are huge volumes. It depends on what the countries decide to do, and it depends on the local conditions and the availability of data and the national team, and there is not one single schedule.
The involvement of people with disabilities in educational decision-making. Now, this question goes to Mr. Doumbouya. Again, how can we increase the involvement of people with disabilities in educational decision-making? Mr. Doumbouya, your thoughts on this question?
Thank you. I think we've done that in Sierra Leone through many ways, through the Lewiland program, particularly so our work with organizations of persons with disabilities, which are led by people with disabilities themselves. And so by ensuring that they are part of the decision-making at the performance management monitoring meetings, they bring out issues, particularly that relates to children with learners with disability in the school system. They're able to table those issues. We strengthen the OPD themselves so that they don't come with different views. They're unified and they discuss district issues that relates to education and inclusion. And they're there with the district directors and sometimes with the national level. They're there with the special educational needs office, and they're able to bring out these issues and they're able to see decisions. In fact, to the extent that we've now got, when these district education meetings are being held, there's specific agenda item to do with disability. It's part of the agenda of these meetings. And so there's been a lot of work in ensuring that not only have we strengthened their capacity, but we've actually enabled them to participate in these meetings. And thirdly, I think it has to do with at the national level, ensuring that there is a more, I mentioned about the stigma and perception. We've been able to remove that at the national level. So people with disabilities are able to sit right with the minister, with the directors at the national level and bring out these issues. And they're also incorporated as part of the Lewiland they incorporated as the director of SEND sits at the steering committee where they discuss strategic issues too. So overall, there's been a lot of work in ensuring that there's a total buy-in from leadership at the MBSSE. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doumbaya, for your reflections on this. We're moving into the last question since we are running late, so apologies for that. This last question goes to Mr. Chow. Please note that all the other questions that were posted in the chat will be responded to on the platform. So please bear with us. But now to the last question of the event. What are the risks if inclusion isn't budgeted for from the start? Now that question comes to us from Tairu Bari from Mali. Mr. Chow, what are the risks if inclusion isn't budgeted for from the start?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, yes, loud and clear. Oh, no, sorry, we've lost the speaker. No.
Hearing you.
Hello?
Hello, Monsieur Chow, we have problems in hearing you.
Hello?
Yeah, we have problems in hearing you. So,
Bonne planification. Et si on parle de planification,
we're going to continue with the program. So, merci beaucoup, but the connection is really too.
Allô, oui.
Oui, c'est trop, Monsieur Chow. On va arrêter là parce que.
So we'll stop now, Mr. Cho, because the connection is not very good. So we will move on. We cannot hear you, so we move on. Thank you, Mr. Chow.
Je vais continuer avec le programme. Merci beaucoup. So I'm now, first of all, thank you again to the three panelists. Apologies for cutting short the question and answer session, but we are running late because of some internet issues. I'm now handing over to Sylvia, the project manager for the Planning for Inclusion program. Yes, please, Sylvia, over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, Oswald, Mr. Doumbaya, and all the participants who have really helped us have a very fruitful discussion. The discussions are very interesting. We will answer all your questions, and you will find all the documents of the webinar on the platform with more resources. You will find it on the COP-DIESP platform. You have seen in the chat the link for those of you who are not there yet. We have 251 members from 73 different countries. So we have a lot of exchanges. Once again, really thank you to all of you. And we have thank you to our head of IIEP, UNESCO IIEP Africa. And we would like to tell you how happy you are that you are so committed for the progress of this education, inclusive education, and see you soon and see you on the platform of the DIESP. On the DIESP platform, sorry. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you to all of you.